everybody, and welcome to today's episode of Attendance Bias. I am your host, Brian Weinstein. You know, prom night is full of cliches. Carnations, gowns, tuxedos, slow dances, limousines, and so on. Now, take all of those tropes and add an unexpected twist. Your after party is taking your limo with a bunch of friends into Manhattan to see Phish play 2 sets at the hottest live music club in the city. That is the story of today's guest, Josh Gertz. Josh is here to tell us about his prom after party, which was Phish's show at the Wetlands on June 9th, 1990. My prom after party was to go to Limelight Nightclub and then Wildwood, New Jersey for the weekend. All these years later, I would trade that for Josh's experience in a heartbeat. Phish was in a transitional period in 1990. They were still composing their multi-part nerd rock opuses, but they were also poking out of the comfort zone of the Northeast, slowly growing their audience while they infused their strange band personality with musical virtuosity. It's arguably for the better that Josh didn't know what he was getting into, because even 35 years ago, the band was figuratively and literally pushing the boundaries of themselves and their audiences. This incredible music all played out against the backdrop of the Wetlands Preserve in New York City. Talking about Lower Manhattan is a constant refrain in today's conversation. Josh is originally from northern New Jersey, and I'm originally from Long Island, so two households both alike in dignity. Going into the city to see live jam band music bore some common talking points between the two of us, and that was just the beginning of our conversation. So bring a change of clothes, cool off if you need to during set break, and give Trey a high five as Josh Gertz tells us about Phish at the Wetlands on June 9th, 1990. Josh, welcome to Attendance Bias. How are you?
I am great, Brian. Thanks so much for having me.
It is my pleasure to speak with you today because you picked a show, and I'll even zoom out a little bit, a year that is kind of underrepresented on this show, on Attendance Bias is what I mean, because a lot of people have chosen 1999, a lot of people recently have chosen 2024, but we are going all the way back to pre-internet, or mostly pre-internet days, to June 9th, 1990 at the Wetlands, a legendary New York City venue that Phish was a familiar guest. They were always there, it seemed, and it was kind of the epicenter at the time of the emerging neo-hippie jam band scene. So to get to speak to somebody who was there for kind of a pivotal show, but also a pivotal year and part of their history, I can't wait to hear your recollections of what it was like seeing them in New York City, but not at Madison Square Garden, at a show that needs to fit significantly less than 19,000 people.
Yeah, it was a pretty amazing experience, and one that had a somewhat significant impact on the rest of my life.
I can't wait. But before we get to the Wetlands, let's get to know you as a fan, Josh, for the Attendance Bias Lightning Round.
Great. Excited. Go.
Attendance Bias Lightning Round.
Josh, when was your first show, and what do you remember from it?
Well, I'm not going to talk too much about what I remember from it, but it's the show that we're going to talk about today, which was June 9th, 1990 at the Wetlands, after my senior high school prom.
So what led you to the Wetlands then?
Oh, we were regulars at the Wetlands. I got to know Pete. I got to know all the bartenders there. We would go there, not every weekend, but once a month at least, to see Zero or the Spin Doctors or Blues Traveler or whoever. No disrespect to them. We would get to the door. I was 17 years old. They would say, "You're 18, right?" I would say, "Yep, I'm 18." "All right, come on inside." And, and we would go see whatever show was there that weekend. And then, when we heard about this was very different, because you had to buy tickets, and that wasn't a thing. You just, at the Wetlands, you just went and paid your $5 or $8, whatever it was, at the door. But someone in our crowd actually had to go into the city like several weeks before this and buy tickets with cash for all of us to get in, because they knew they'd be at max capacity the second they announced it.
And the Wetlands then and now, I know it doesn't exist any longer, but the area, getting to the Wetlands is not easy, even if you live in Manhattan, right? It's in Tribeca, which is, and kind of continues to be, although it's become a lot more populated since the early 90s. Thank you, Robert De Niro. But, it's kind of a bitch to get to. Where were you coming from? Where did you live at the time?
In northern New Jersey. I was going to high school, grew up in northern New Jersey, about an hour outside the city. And if you drove in through the Holland Tunnel, The Wetlands actually wasn't that far from the entrance and exit to the Holland Tunnel, so we would just park on some side street, probably illegally, probably risking our cars getting broken into, and we would go.
That's a good point. I was thinking because I grew up on Long Island. So for me, getting to Manhattan was about an hour, and then getting to the Wetlands or to Tribeca was like another 40 minutes once I got to Penn Station.
Yeah,
So it was a real hassle. The Holland Tunnel was kind of a no-go from
right.
coming from the east of
Yeah.
Manhattan.
There were lots of places in Manhattan that we would take the train to, any shows at the Garden, anytime we were going to Central Park, or even if we were going to the Village, but not the Wetlands, because the Wetlands wasn't near anything. If you took the train in, you then had to get in a cab and take that to the Wetlands, and then a cab back to where the train was. I mean,
Right.
it was in the I wouldn't say the middle of nowhere, because that's not possible in Manhattan, but it was not easily accessible.
And you mentioned something else about all the other shows that you and your friends were regulars at the Wetlands. And you mentioned Zero, you mentioned the Spin Doctors, Blues Traveler. I think this is all part of the context, and we'll get to that a little bit later in the show. But if you could comment a little bit on this, I think Phish fans in 2025 don't quite understand that Phish wasn't always the big dog, right? They were not always the most popular band. At this time in 1990, my understanding is that Blues Traveler was kind of at the top of the ticket, that they were the big band that everyone expected to blow up, and they did in their way. But Phish was not always the top ticket. Am I right on that? Or because you said you guys had to get physical tickets for that and not otherwise, you just showed up at the door. Is my understanding of that in terms of the pecking order of the jam band scene?
You're right. I think Phish started equal. This is not their first show there, and I think their first shows before this were all just show up at the door and we'll put as many people inside, which they were famous for doing. We'll talk about that in a minute. But I think by the time they'd gotten to June of 1990, he knew he was going to sell out, and Peter had a constant fight with the fire marshals as well. So he had to keep a reasonable number of people. So for this, when it was announced, which again, I mean, you're talking pre-internet. I think somebody heard about it in the Village Voice or something like that, that they were going to be selling tickets for this, and they were like $18 a ticket or something like that. So
that's a lot for that time.
Oh yeah, it was a lot. So somebody went in with, I don't know, $200 and some odd in cash and bought enough tickets for. I'm terrible at math, so some number 15 of us to go or whatever it is, and then we all had these little. I don't have it. I thought about this for this show, and I have tons of ticket stubs too. We had a little green sort of tearaway ticket that they had made.
And talk about stuffing as many people in as possible. The walls of the Wetlands could bend if you got enough people in there, right? With the amount of sweat and the amount of condensation, the Wetlands was not exactly a spacious venue either.
So all right. So let's just get into this, right? So the Wetlands is one of the greatest bars ever existed in my life. I'm sure everybody has one of those for their life, but so many interesting things about this place. First of all, I think it had a capacity of about 600, but the reason that it had a capacity of 600 is that they actually had an upstairs and a downstairs.
Right.
And the downstairs was like a smoking lounge where you just kind of hung out. And there were always normally at a show, let's say 300 people upstairs and 100 people downstairs just hanging out. The night of this, there were 700 people, whatever capacity, they were 20% past it, and everyone was upstairs. So there was no room. You couldn't move. It was the most crowded concert will ever go to. It was so far unsafe looking at it back. You know, if something bad had happened, we would all have been trampled or burned or whatever. And we were smushed into this teeny little room, which was notorious for already being very warm. In the middle of winter, we would go there in shorts and a T-shirt, knowing it was going to be 90 degrees inside. This show was something else. I remember this because we had changed from I had come from my senior prom. We went to the prom till about 8:30. Then like about 12 of us or 15 of us got in 3 different limos and went from the prom directly to the show, even got changed in the car. So by the time we got out of the car, again, I'm wearing shorts and a T-shirt, but this was a different kind of hot. This was sauna hot. This was over 100 degrees hot. And yeah, everybody was dripping. The walls were dripping. I think if I'm not mistaken, somebody went and got like garbage bags and put them over the soundboard because it was literally dripping off the ceiling onto the soundboard, and they were afraid it was going to electrocute or short out. I don't think I've ever experienced anything quite like that at a concert.
Well, let's save more of those details for later. So let's fast forward for now in our time machine. If this was your first show on June 9th, 1990, at the time of this recording, at least, what was your most recent show, and what did you think of it?
Yeah, so my last shows were all the way back in 23. They did 3 nights here in Alpharetta, Georgia, and I went to all 3, and they were just spectacular. They were just I was just blown away. Tweezer is one of my favorite songs, and it may be the best version I ever heard. And I was just everybody having a great time. And there was this weird rumor that some guy had made a T-shirt saying, "You haven't played You Enjoy Myself Yem in Atlanta in 20 years." And that became some big rumor that Trey heard about. And so, of course, he comes out and talks about it the third night, and they encore with it. And everybody went crazy. And they were just fantastic.
So you mentioned just a little earlier that you went to this Wetlands show straight from your prom in a limo. So I
Yep.
have to ask, what was your prom song?
Wonderful Tonight by Eric Clapton, which is not the song I voted for. And I used to be very bitter about that for some petty, childish reason. So I didn't like that song because I didn't want it to be my prom song.
Do you remember what you voted for?
No. At this point, that's what I mean. That's how petty it was, because clearly it was so important that I don't even remember the other choices.
But that is a classic, right? That is a bona
it's a
fide
good
classic.
song.
You could look back and say that now.
No, and Clapton's awesome. I've seen him a few times. I saw him on that blues tour he did in the 90s, which was incredible. And yeah, Slow Hand's one of the greats. So yeah, I don't know what my anger was about back then.
And when you and your friends were in the limos going from, I assume it was in New Jersey, your prom.
New Jersey, yeah.
Right. My prom was at a place called the Water's Edge, which is in Long Island City. You could see the Manhattan skyline from it. Yeah. So you were able to take a ride, a fancy ride from Jersey to the Lower West Side, I guess we could call it, to Tribeca. Were you all in your gowns and your tuxedos? Is that what you were changing in from?
Yeah. Yeah. I thought long and hard about what I was going to say on this podcast about that ride. And I'll just say, like not every, but many good, responsible high schoolers, when we walked out of the prom, nobody had a drink. We were completely sober. We had a good time dancing and high-fiving at the prom. About 45 to an hour later, when we arrived at the Wetlands, I don't think anybody was.
It was an eventful ride.
That was a very eventful ride. It was a party. We were having a great time. The whole rest of the night gets blurrier and blurrier until we all pass out in those same limos at like 2 a.m. on the way home.
Of course, especially after this show that we're going to talk about.
Yeah.
So one thing that I loved about listening back to this show at your recommendation was I had the recording open on Phish.in on one browser window and then Phish.net on the next browser window, because I was so curious with each song that they played, each next song that they played, when did it debut and how old was it? So songs like Reba and Bouncing Around the Room were relatively brand new. So I wanted to ask, how familiar were you with Phish at the time that this show came around?
Almost not at all. My experience with Phish, I was a big Deadhead. I was exposed to the Dead in the summer of '85, and I started going to Dead shows with my friends. I'd been to 10 or 15, maybe even more by the time this Phish show rolled around. About, 4 months before my prom, or 3 months, I was riding in a friend's car, and he grabbed a bootleg, a cassette, and it was clearly a bootleg. And back then, to me, all bootlegs were Grateful Dead bootlegs. There weren't other bands. It's not like today where the scene is so varied and all these great contributors. So I assumed, bad word, that he was just putting Dead on the radio. So he popped this in, and I hear them sort of jamming in this very non-traditional way. And I look at him and I say, "Is this like some early bootleg?" And he looks at me, he's like, "No, man, this is Phish." And I was like, "What?" And it turns out that was You Enjoy Myself. And then I listened to Tweezer and Fee and a few others. And I was like, wow, this is really cool. And I listened to that tape with him, I don't know, 3 times, 5 times. That was the entirety of my experience with the band. I was basically going to see a band that I knew very little about, other than there was a lot of buzz around them. They were so cool that you had to buy tickets to get into the Wetlands. It was exactly perfectly the night of our prom. A whole bunch of us were going. It seemed like the ultimate decision to make. Nobody really wanted to go to the prom. The prom was something you went to say you went, to take the picture with your date, to dance to Wonderful Tonight. And then as soon as that was done, we were like, and we're out. So the answer to your question is I had very little exposure to them. I knew a couple of songs. Ironically, again, Tweezer was one of those songs. And then I sort of walk in and they start playing it. But yeah, not a lot.
Well, then did you have a first favorite song? Was there a song that grabbed you when you were first getting into the band?
Well, again, I don't really remember specifically like if any of those songs kept me, but I walked in. One of the things that you don't notice about this show, and again, I don't know if we're supposed to talk about this now or later, is that it started very late. We walked in at say 9:30, 9:40, and they were still only halfway through the first set.
Shows at the Wetlands always started late. I remember seeing Mo there, and
Mm-hmm.
this was a release party for their first live album called L.
Mm-hmm.
And every ticket got you a copy of the album, a double disc too on CD. It was a big deal. And they didn't start till like 10:30 or 11.
Yeah.
And it was a 3 set show. We walked in the middle of the first set. We were already running late. And again, like I said, it took forever to get there in the first place, but they played one acoustic set to start. And it was, I didn't know about this at the time, the Timmy Tucker Overture, right? Their own little rock opera. But, and so we got there late and we even left before it was over because it was already coming up on 3 a.m.
I mean, it wasn't quite that late, but yeah, I mean, again, we walked in at, I'm going to go a quarter to 10, and I'm going to go with, they were either playing Reba or Dinner and a Movie. So, I mean, they were only like 4 songs into the show.
So since we're waxing poetic about the Wetlands and this era of Phish's history, which is what this podcast is all about, if you could time travel and see Phish again in one of these small venues like the Wetlands, but let's eliminate that from the list, where would you go?
Oh my gosh. I don't know. It's hard to say. I was so fortunate. We snuck out of work one day, and I was at the tapings of sessions at West 54th Street that they did, and there were like 100 people there. So I don't know how much more intimate it gets than that. So I don't know if I sort of pain for the good old days, having been very fortunate to be at some really iconic experience. You know what I've never done? I've never seen Phish on New Year's Eve at Madison Square Garden. I would rather have that experience, or the show with the whales flying around. That would be, to me, I'd rather go back and see that, or go back and see the Happy Helping book, the whole Gamehenge thing. I mean, that to me would be really amazing.
Well, as I live in New York City, I'll save you a spot. You just give me a call.
Please.
Next time you're able.
I get the invite, but the whole wife and kids thing gets in the way.
To wrap it all up, the question I ask everybody, what is the weirdest thing you've ever seen at a Phish show?
Oh boy. All right, I'm going to go with a tie here, and I don't mean to be so political, but I'm going to go with either the hot dog New Year's '93 or the naked picture at the Great Went. So for those of you who don't know, there was this concert in Maine, the Great Went, all the way up at this Air Force Base, Loring's in the middle of nowhere. And they decided they were going to break the record for the largest number of naked people in a photo. And anybody could come be in this photo, which I'm very happy I opted out of doing. But it's not that. You wake up from your tent and you walk outside because you hear sort of a rumbling, and then 2,000 or so naked people walk past you in a parade, all going, woo! And I'll never forget that. That sort of burned in my mind, whether I want to or not. Yeah. Well, either that or, I was at the Boston Garden on New Year's '93, and you hear of rumblings over the speaker tray saying, hey, we've been working all evening. Nobody's got a chance to eat. Somebody sent a hot dog and something to the stage, and then they come out and the hot dog comes down and everyone's like, what the heck is that? And then, of course, they get in the hot dog and they're flying around the stadium. And what's incredible about that is that my sister, whom I love very much, Brianna, shout out, had much better seats than me. And they were on the floor. And from the hot dog, they were throwing out ping pong balls, which she caught like 6. So I, to this day, have 2 of the ping pong balls that the band threw out of the hot dog while they were flying around the stadium. And that's about the weirdest thing you'll ever see anywhere at a concert. I mean, so much so it's in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
When was this show played?
So we've done a little bit of this already, but let's take a visit back to the summer of 1990, but specifically through the lens of where Phish was at and how they were playing. So a little bit of Phish.net research tells us that Phish played 92 shows in 1990. And according to Phish.net, they played at least one show in every single month of the year, although they only played one show apiece in July and one in August. So they must have been recording Lawn Boy, is my guess, which had a problematic release in September. I know they released it, and then the distribution company went bust, so they had to re-release it. I don't know. It's strange to go over and find all the details. Although previously, when I had Dave Zizix Steinberg on it, ask him. He'll tell you all about it and every single little detail that you didn't even know existed. But it's hard to even call this a summer tour, since the band was touring nonstop from January all the way through May, pretty much. So there was no real break. They would often play up to 6 consecutive nights in 5 states.
Yep.
They were working really hard at this time. So when I looked at their itinerary, April flows right into May, which flows right into June without any distinct pause between months or seasons until the band plays that very well-known show on June 16th at the Townsend Family Park in Vermont. That was, I don't know if it was one of my first tapes, but it's one of my first well-remembered tapes. And after that is when they began recording, and they took off for most of the summer. In fact, I looked this up on Phish.com. This tour was announced as, quote, the April, May, June update. It wasn't even called a tour. It was just an update. And to your point earlier, according to Phish.com, this was Phish's 7th show at the Wetlands. You talked about how hot and crowded it was. Phish.com says that it was so crowded and steamy from people dancing that the ceiling and walls were dripping with condensation. And you were correct about your garbage bag. It said that Phish.com said that it forced Paul Languedoc, the sound guy at the time, it forced him to cover the soundboard console with plastic.
It was like nothing I've ever seen. Again, it wouldn't have surprised me if somebody blacked out. I mean, it was just that hot.
To take a bigger look at it, though, in 1990, Phish was still very much a regional band, right? They were not well known outside of the Northeast, even though they were starting to puncture some venues outside of the Northeast. They were beginning to make inroads in other colleges and, quote, legitimate venues that were bigger than clubs, but also still smaller than theaters that they would start to play in maybe 91 or 92, like the Chance in Poughkeepsie, New York, or 23 East Cabaret in Philadelphia, which would be on the docket this year. Remember, we're still only halfway through 1990. So I always think of that, and being in a college band myself when I was in college, to be able to play, if the Wetlands were still around at that time, or I think the 23 East Cabaret has since changed ownership or venues, like if I got to play in my band at those venues, I would consider that like, oh, I'm in a real band, even though those venues, like you said earlier, are only maybe 500 or 600 capacity. But now Phish is doing it.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the progression of so many of those bands in that particular scene, and there were at that time, like you said, like key clubs in every city that you had to play to say you had made it. Absolutely, you had the Bowery Ballroom that was brand new at that time. Man, if you could get in there, you were big. That was 1,500 seats. You were a real band. I mean, that wasn't just a bar band. That was that next step. So yeah, in New York, you were right. There was like little bars like the Continental that you would go see the punk bands or the smaller bands or even CBGB's, which was little. But
or Kenny's Castaways, for example.
Kenny's Castaways, absolutely. Or so many of those bands down in Lodo, in Soho. I mean, Lodo. If you were playing the Wetlands on Saturday night, you were drawing a crowd. That's who played Say Wetlands on Saturday night. I mean, there were hundreds of people there to see you.
Right. And Phish was, I think, from a business perspective, looking at it, I think they were trying to crawl out of the generic Main Street bars that can be found in any college town and play at these venues. So I noticed when I looked at the whole year, the 1990 itinerary, that they played a lot of these venues several times in 1990. For example, they came back to the Wetlands, I think in September. I think the date is September 13th. Where they debuted. So just 3 months later. But in addition to that, they would play the Haunt in Ithaca, New York, which has a 500-person capacity, the Capitol Theater in Port Chester, which is, again, an active theater, the Somerville Theater in Massachusetts with a 900-person capacity, the Campus Club in Providence. So to me, this is like a band in the trenches, in their van, I'm sure, playing Main Street venues early in the year, like up to this 6-month point, trying to capitalize and then return a few months later so that you and your friends who you came from the prom, maybe when they came back in September, each one of you would bring 2 more friends. And now that doubled the amount. So Phish can say, all right, we can't play the Wetlands anymore. Now we have to move up somewhere else. Now we have to go to the Beacon Theater or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't see them again. They were at some jam thing in Maryland a couple of years later, like in Columbia, Maryland. I went to University of Maryland. So by the time I saw them again, they had gone from bar to larger venues. They were much more of a well-known name. Even in that 2-year span from 1990 to 1992, they had gone from sort of a regional Vermont, New York kind of touring band to a nationally known name. Oh, rumblings of, are they the next Grateful Dead, or is there something special about them?
Right. This is probably one that started as like a legitimate conversation you could have in parking lots or at shows, either Phish shows or shows of bands other than Phish. Like anyone who thinks that they made the leap from like a 500 person capacity, the Haunt in Burlington to Madison Square Garden just needs to take a look at 1990, because we talk a lot as a fan base about 1996 being a traditional year, 1997 locking in. 1990 is a transitional year, both from songwriting, but also from touring, from business. And the band themselves, speaking about their music, they seemed very heavily focused on owning their like odd personality and perfecting their songs and kind of mashing them together. So looking ahead at this show, there's not a lot of long jams or any wild improvisation. Like Reba is the longest song in the first set, and it's 12 minutes. And the recorded part of Reba is like 8 minutes, the song portion. Harpua is the longest of the second set out of 15 songs.
Right. We'll get into it. The thing that amazes me about Harpua, I want to go back and listen to the recording. I want to meet the guy who in the audience either had a copy of the set list or was a big enough fan at that point to recognize Harpua from the first few notes, who starts yelling, Harpua! And I'm like I'm listening to that now, like, how in June of 1990 could you have been a big enough fan to even like make that call? Bravo to that guy.
It's funny you say that, because a previous episode about a show from 1990, I can't place it right now, somewhat you could tell when they were going through Stash, I think they had just started, and that song didn't debut very long before. People were already excited. So by 1990, really dedicated hardcore fans already had their favorites.
Oh yeah, clearly. It was all new to me.
So that's the big picture of Phish in 1990, at least the first half of 1990. Josh, I know you mentioned that you were a senior in high school, you were graduating, or you were at your prom or leaving your prom. Why do you have attendance bias toward this show? Like, who and where were you in the summer of 1990?
Well, I was a senior in high school. I had committed to going to the University of Maryland in the fall, which I was super excited about. My parents are awesome, so they really let me kind of have my summer and be me. I had a great time. I went to, I don't know, 5 or 6 Dead shows. I went to Pittsburgh. I went to Boston. I mean, it was a great summer. This show particularly, I can remember thinking, well, it was clear, I think, from being there that this was something special, that this was not, like, again, having been in the same bar where there were 30 people there and nobody was even watching the band on stage, and then being there for this, where there was a level of excitement where the walls were dripping, was, something else. So you could tell already there was something special, but it felt like this was something different. Like, this was ours. We were young. I was 18 years old. And don't get me wrong, I love the Grateful Dead, still love the Grateful Dead, saw them, the Dead and Company at the Sphere last year, all that. But this wasn't my dad's music. This wasn't 70s pop hippie Deadhead story. This was ours. This was something new that didn't belong to anyone but the new fans of this band. And immediately everybody kind of wanted to take ownership of that and feel this exciting connection with something. And I love what you said a few minutes ago, and I've actually struggled to put it. They were intentionally a little bit oddly different. They were embracing their oddity, and that was something other bands didn't. They shunned that out. In the 90s, you were like trying to be technically specific. Even and again, I love Blues Traveler, but look at Blues Traveler. Every note is perfect. Chan Kinchla and they're all like step by step every note, whereas Phish are intentionally pushing the boundaries of both melodic and timing.
Set 1.
So to look at this show, first of all, thank you for picking it, because on Phish.in, there's a soundboard available. And thank goodness there is, because this is an extremely fast show and there's a tremendous amount of energy here. It opens with Possum. And I love that this show and this song, whoever the promoter is, I don't know if it's Pete Shapiro, who you name checked a little bit earlier, he's yelling into the mic as the band starts the Possum intro that this is, quote, their last club night of the summer. And by the way, Ginger Baker is playing next week.
Yeah, that sounds like Pete. I'll have to go back and listen to the recording. And unfortunately, I've been lucky to that somebody did get the soundboard so I could hear it now live, but I wasn't there at that moment. We didn't walk in until a few minutes later, so I missed Possum and Lawn Boy. But Lawn Boy is they so fast, right? Could they get through that any faster? It's just hysterical. It's awesome.
Yeah, it is. And the funny thing about it, I thought, is they go crazy on Possum. They have like feedback games back and forth where they quiet down and they play into typical, what I would call typical Possum dynamics for the time, where they're very quiet when they start the jam, and then it gets raging, 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 and then when Trey ends his solo, it gets quiet for Page to start, and they're already developing these habits that would last them, at least to date, what the audience can expect when they hear the beginning of a certain song. And like, how lucky are we that there's a soundboard available? And then they play Lawn Boy, which is a chill out follow up. Like, it's so rare that you need a chill out this early in the set. Plus, it's an indicator of the different styles that this band's capable of.
Definitely, that's this whole show, right? The first set, they stop almost in between almost every song and recalibrate, and then they come with something different. Then they stop and they come with something different, and then the second set is completely opposite, right?
Following up is Reba, which I noticed throughout, and this will be a recurring theme. I'll probably say it 3 or 4 times throughout the whole conversation. It's a lot slower than we would soon get used to. Like, in this version, you can actually hear the band enunciate the lyrics, which is a new experience for me.
Yeah, it's a great version of that song. They definitely take the jam into a sort of an interesting place. You don't normally hear that jam going. And looking back, sort of as much of my memory as I can put together, if I had to guess, that's probably what they were playing as we're sort of pushing our way in the front door and trying to get anywhere near it. And again, and we'll talk more about this in a few minutes, but so many more people than should have been in there. I could maybe get 10 feet into the door before I hit the wall of people. So for the first, 15, 20 minutes, as we sort of slither our way through the crowd, we are very far in the back, and I can't see them. I don't know what they look like. And there's just sort of this jam band on stage. So yeah, but I think it's really interesting that, that song that they tend to jam that one now for even maybe less is really a focal point of that first set there. It's really a song that they were embracing. They were pushing it that night.
Who were never able to get to the wetlands for whatever reason, if you're picturing it in your mind's eye, just imagine you get through the front door and maybe generously 15 feet away is the band. And I think in the back left in the corner is kind of a 3/4 scale Volkswagen bus. So the stage barely exists. and there's really no division between the audience and the band. So when Josh is saying that he walked in and he can't really see the band, that's absurd because you could almost see everybody,
So
including the
they
band.
Okay, so I hate to correct you because you seem so like such a great guy, but they had two doors that they would use depending on the night, and they, like
Okay.
you said, they had sort of a barn door, which I'll talk about in a second, a big metal barn door that they would open up next to where the stage was. Where on the less crowded nights, you would come around the side and everybody would come in there. But on the more crowded nights, they had a door that was actually, I think that was Delancey Street, if I'm right, that was
Yeah,
on the
that's the one
corner.
I think I'm used
That
to.
was there was so that's the regular door, and that's at the far end, right? So it was a railroad basically. It was one long room, and when you walked in, there was a bar on the left and the VW bus on the right, and then there was maybe, I don't know, 50 feet, and then you went into sort of the back area where the stage was, and the metal doors, and the green room, which was stuck in the far back where the bands were stuck in the corner and they couldn't even get out if they wanted to, and all of that. So for this night, they were using the sort of the front doors. We would go up the steps, and we were far from the stage. So again, it was loud as hell, but we couldn't see anything for the first couple of tracks.
And this version of Reba, I mentioned before, it's kind of slow. Like they're obviously practiced, but they haven't quite mastered the song. It's only about 8 months old at this point, since its debut, I should say. And it's clear that they're going over it as they would in rehearsal. So the fact that this is the longest song in the set doesn't really indicate a big jam. Like these days, we'd look at the set list and see how long the timing of each song. They're just playing this multi-part composition at kind of rehearsal speed. It's not slow per se, but let's say it's good for anyone who's trying to learn the song on your instrument. This is a good version to hear, despite the fact that at the end there is some really nice interplay between Page's electric piano and Trey at about 8 minutes. So like hints at the bliss that the song would bring to so many fans in the future. But it's not exactly the rushing, crazy, oh my God, Reba, that we would come to expect before they launch right into Dinner and a Movie. This
Right.
one is well practiced.
Listening to this again and being a fan now for so many years, I think I hear a Page much more asserting himself, much more leading the way. This is before Trey, in my mind, sort of reached that next level of amazingness. I don't know if it was when he got sober or if he just got religion or just more practice or whatever. But I think Trey today is one of the great guitarists in the world. And I think back then, Page was as much leading the band as Trey was. And you hear it in Reba, you hear it in Dinner and a Movie. We'll talk again in Bouncing, but it's much more keyboard heavy than
Yeah.
I think those tracks have become, particularly in the sort of high level solos that Trey has now laced into some of those. So yeah, they were very much a keyboard quirky sort of led band in that night. And I hear much more of that in this recording than I do when I see them today.
Let's go out to dinner and see a movie. Let's go out to dinner and see a movie. Let's go out to dinner and see a movie. Let's go out to dinner and see a movie.
Absolutely. And Dinner and a Movie is such a rarity now. I just checked the stat that they played Dinner and a Movie 49 times in 1990. That's more than every other show,
Wow.
right? And now it's kind of like,
Wow.
Dinner and a Movie, what a bust out.
Yeah, I haven't seen it in years. Yeah, I would love to. Yeah, you're right. They didn't have as many songs. I mean, they were a newer band. They were just getting where they are. I mean, I was going back through this show and looking at some of the other bootlegs, some of the other shows around this date, and they repeat a lot. Sometimes 2 nights in a row. So, I mean, there's a lot of the catalog isn't as deep.
Right. And they had their lead songs what I mean by that is You Enjoy Myself has always been their lead song, and Divided Sky also kind of their trademark song. Dinner and a Movie was one of those. At the time, it was just right in line with those others, and Reba was the new kid on the block.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and the crowd was really into it that night. There was you don't hear it as well, I guess, because it's a soundboard and they did a good job.
Yeah.
But there was a lot of screaming of "Let's go out to dinner and see a movie" as the band was saying those words. The crowd was really into that. So
And then they follow up with another slower tune, even though it's not a slow tune, with Bouncing Around the Room. Again, it's kind of like Reba in that sense. It debuted in January earlier that year. So again, it's only about 5-ish months old, and it's on the rehearsal tempo. It's not fully rounded or polished. Like the bump isn't there, is the way I wrote it down for Bouncing Around the Room. It's still kind of tentative, but the song is all there, but it's not exactly, let's say, a live one version, which to me is kind of the prototypical recording of this song.
The woman was a dream I had, though rather hard to keep. For when my eyes were watching hers, they closed, and I was still asleep. When my hand was holding hers, she whispered words and I awoke, and faintly bouncing round the room, the echo of whomever spoke. And I awoke, and faintly bouncing round the room, the echo of whomever spoke. The place I sought was far beneath the surface of the sea. My sight was poor, but I was sure the sirens sang their song for me. They dance above me as I sing. I see them through a crystal haze, and hear their sweet sound bouncing round the never-ending choral maze. The crystal haze, and hear them bouncing round the room, the never-ending choral maze. Then before and now once more, I'm bouncing round the room.
yeah, this song was really special for me. Again, sort of following our night, it took us 15, 20 minutes or whatever to kind of push our way to a spot where we could see the stage. I think we were standing on the stairs in front of the first bar, so we were one stair up because I was a short, skinny little 17-year-old kid, 18-year-old kid, and then they stopped and they start playing the song, and I'd never heard it before. It was the first time, and then you get that is sort of intro drum beat, and then they're playing it. It's cute, and, they have the harmony that they're doing, and then they pick it up a little, and Mike and Trey start jumping. And I, in my mind, when I first said to you, I think they had trampolines. They didn't have trampolines. There's no way there was enough room on that stage for the actual trampolines at that gag, but they were definitely doing the same in sync jumping piece. And I remember being just utterly mesmerized. What is this? And that song actually had like a really big impact on me. And from that moment, I was a bit sort of frozen, looking at the stage, thinking, okay, this is really something I've never seen before. Who are these people doing this incredible harmony while jumping up and down in harmony also, and the crowd just loving it.
Right. Well, they were performing.
Yeah.
Right. They're not exactly a crazy theatrical band. They kind of make their own fun, and they do it in the basics. Jumping up and down is a big performance from Phish, because all of the performative, the theatricalities in their music and the personality.
It was awesome. I don't know what else to say. As an 18-year-old experiencing it for the first time and hearing this great song that I went on to listen to that song. I sought it out after that. If I had Phish bootlegs, I only wanted ones that had that song on it and stuff. I loved that song for a long time right after that show. And yeah, that was sort of like a magic moment for me. And then getting ahead, that they play this great version of Bouncing Around the Room, which even if you go back on it to this day, keeps up with some of the later versions. It's not, you're right, the song is all there. It's not quite as exciting. The highs aren't quite as high as they learn to take that later on, but the song is all there. And then they jump right into Tweezer, which is one of the only like 3 songs I knew by Phish at that time. And I was like throwing my hands up in the air, and everybody was just dancing and jamming. And that's when it started to get really hot and the place started to kind of bounce. And yeah, it was really borderline religious experience.
Well, some things never change, I guess.
Yeah.
But it's funny you said that, how you knew the song and your hands were in the air with Tweezer. This song is less than 3 months old at the time. And I don't know if it's because, like you said, it's a soundboard recording, but there's no roar of anticipation once Tweezer begins because it's an infant. And it's got really weird vocals. You know, once they begin at 30 seconds, Mike is just growling in his weirdo way, just growling and yelling the lyrics. Like, it's almost surprising looking back how, 20 whatever years later, it's almost, or 30 years, I guess, it's almost surprising that it stuck around and eventually flourished, at least in my opinion, because this is just one riff and one line.
So in my mind, again, having thought about this show before, I went back and listened to it. None of that was there. It was the greatest version ever of this song, clearly. And then I went back and listened to it, and that's not the case. There's a lot of screaming. It's definitely off beat a few times. I guess it was just the guitar riff at the beginning that I had heard on that one and only bootleg I had heard from them previously. So it was a bit addictive, that Trey riff at the beginning of it, which I will not hum and save everyone that. But I instantly recognized it. And even though I guess it was weird, it was really exciting. And the crowd got really into that song. That was pretty hot. There was a lot of energy in the room by the time they got, and don't get me wrong, the yelling probably helped.
Well, I was interested to hear your remembrance of this, specifically this part of the show, because there's a lot of weird yelling, growling, and like sound effects. And this is not too far from where they would find themselves in, say, 1994 or 1995, when they would really push the audience or push themselves to get as weird as they could and see, like, can you take it? And I just had this thought, I can't wait to hear what it was like to hear this in the Wetlands, where you have like no elbow room, basically. Like, it's a lot to take in. But I did like that they broke it down to the very old time ending where they just slowed down, almost like a train stopping with one note at a time.
Yeah, I again, going back and listening to it, it does fizzle, to me at least, it fizzles out a little bit. I think if you look at that same song 2 years later, it wouldn't have ended that way. They would have pushed it a little bit harder, but I don't know. I just didn't know what to expect. And I remember the crowd really, really being into that track. And then again, because you're listening to a soundboard, they eliminated a lot of the gaps. I would say there was probably a minute, which is, I don't know, that doesn't sound like a lot, but that's a lot of dead air time. There was at least a minute of 60 seconds or more of complete dead air time of them talking and fixing guitars. I mean, there's this long space between Tweezer and what's next after Tweezer?
Uncle Pen.
Uncle Pen. I mean, so there's no flow. Again, they're just high energy when they're playing, and then they're, okay, what are we going to do next? And then high energy when they're playing, and it didn't seem very mapped out.
And that seemed like a recurring idea, or a motif, I guess I should say, that the band in 1990, in playing venues that are this small and where the division between the audience and the band or the stage is so thin, almost non-existent, that it almost feels like you're in on a practice, on a basement rehearsal of the foremost virtuosic musicians that you could ever see. But like, it doesn't feel like you're at a crazy rock show. It's more like you're seeing this amazing band taking it easy, even though they're playing energetic songs. I don't mean it that way. They're not as tight as they would come to be because they're still growing into themselves in their music. And especially up the next sequence, which is Mike's groove, Mike's I Am Hydrogen, Weekapaw groove. You use this phrase that there's a lot of space. There's lots of space in this song, like a lot of drum fills, a lot of guitar riffs, where now it's usually composed sections.
they were very more experimental at this time, which don't get me wrong, their jams are still experimental, but they were still figuring out these songs. And Mike's song, I go back and I listen to it now. It's a little bit rough. Their harmony's a little bit rough, and I feel like Phish is off once or twice. And but again, firstly, couldn't move, so it didn't matter. Like you were there, you weren't going anywhere. Like once you got to a spot, that was that. But there was something special. You could feel the energy in the air. They could have played "Mary Had a Little Lamb," and I think we all would have cheered.
Yeah, and I'm sure at some point this year they did in the middle of it.
They may have, yeah. At this point, as the night goes on and people are getting me beers, it goes downhill. So
the middle song of this suite, I Am Hydrogen, to me could have been played yesterday. It's so great. It's upbeat. Yeah. There's almost a little improvisation at about a minute in, not quite, but the default back to the usual end of Hydrogen. But this one sounded as smooth as any other song. I could have told you they played this last night at Merriweather Post, and you might believe me. Before they go into Weekapaw Groove, which is strong right from the get-go, and everyone has their standout playing. To me, it sounded like an excuse for everyone in the band to just wail. Like it gets very rock god about 4 minutes in, and it ends a nice tight set with a lot of songs just to get everyone in, packed, and jumping around if you could.
Yeah, going back and listening to it, it felt like they were like, okay, we need to end the set, so we're going to play Weekapaw Groove, and we're really going to kill it at the end of it, because sort of the last, like you said, right in the middle of it, there's this beautiful jam, but then the last minute and a half of it is just fire.
Hi, everybody. Brian here to welcome you to the set break of today's episode of Attendance Bias. First, thank you for listening. And second, just a quick reminder to tell you that even though Attendance Bias comes to you for free, it does take a lot of work and it does take quite a bit of money to keep the lights on here at production. So I just wanted to ask a small favor, if you could support the podcast in any number of the following ways. If you could leave a review or a rating of it on whichever podcast app you use. If you could spread the word, telling a friend or someone you think may be interested in it about it. Or probably the most concrete way is to go to www.buymeacoffee.com/attendancebias and donate however much you can financially to help with the continuing costs of Attendance Bias. So thank you again so much for listening, and I hope you enjoy the second half of today's episode.
Set 2.
Set 2 opens, according to the set list at least, with Led Zeppelin's Whole Lotta Love. So I was really curious because I didn't quite hear it when I pressed play on set 2. But according to Phish.com, Whole Lotta Love was playing on the PA and the band started playing along just for a minute, like long enough for it to count on the set list for stats, as opposed to just a tease. So it's not a full version, but it sounds pretty good. It's like a sound check jam.
Yeah, that's what I remember. Now here's a cool story that I want to make sure I got out. So again, this place is like 110 degrees, and they go off stage after Weekapaw Groove, and immediately they throw open the metal barn doors, and half the crowd, 400 people just pour out like the ocean into the street because everybody's dying of heat and just, needs to get out into the cold night air. Well, me and my friends were like, okay, if you're all going out there, we're going up to the stage. And about 100 of us did not go outside. And so my view for the second set was vastly different, where I'm now 8 feet away from Trey, right in the middle of the stage, right in front. Like I could have high-fived him. I was close enough for that. Maybe 2 people between me and him for the entire second set. So now that they're outside, there's this it's a long break, by the way. It's like an hour, I would say, between the first set and the second set. So they finished the first set. I'm going to go with 11. I'm making this all up. And then they go back on stage like 11:45-ish, 12. So it's now midnight. They've just come back on for their second set, and everyone starts pouring back in behind us. And again, we were less cramped up by the stage than we were back by the bar. So we had this little area. But yeah, they come back out, and there was music playing. Again, I would not have told you it was Led Zeppelin had I not gone back to listen to this. But yeah, they definitely remember that. They just kind of came out and just started jamming with whatever was going on the PA.
Right. So the proper opener for the second set is Harry Hood.
Yep.
Which has a little bit extra on it because this is one of their older songs by now, maybe 5 or 6 years old. Page adds some like jazz stylings on his piano, and then by 7 minutes in, it's virtually the same exact song as it is today, as if they played it last night at Alpharetta, let's say. Like, it takes a little while to gel, But about 2/3 of the way through, by around 8 minutes, the jam takes off and all four band members are complimenting each other, like just for a second. It goes like bobbing and weaving was the phrase I wrote down in my notes. They all touch for a second and then it's back to piecemeal. So they're not a jam band, right? Let's not make any mistakes. They're not a jam band yet. They might be more in style or in line with They Might Be Giants at the time, for example, than the Grateful Dead in terms of their ability to, infuse their personality into their music. But a song like the end of Harry Hood, it connects and then it goes away and they kind of just play their own individual parts and then connects again and they back into their corners. But around 11 minutes, they kind of round that corner and they end the song with a big time peak. My phrase that I wrote was, the whole venue must have been in sweaty ecstasy.
Yeah. Said it right, and I think this also goes back a little bit to support what I said earlier. This is a very page-forward version of this song. He was definitely the co-leader, and I know they're all co-leaders. I'm not trying to judge this band. I have no idea what their internal agreements are, and anyone who says they do is probably full of it. So point is that it just, at least to me, in this night, you hear so much more Page pushing the direction, deciding when they're going to jam out and when they're going to come back in. And not that Trey isn't beautiful in what he's doing. And you're right, the ending of this song is really hot. And everybody is, I think they cut it off on the soundboard, but every time they finish the song, sort of, the crowd goes and screams at full passion, as loud as we could. And that's not on any of that recording. So you did miss that.
Which is unfortunate, but that's why you're here today. You're here to fill in the blanks.
Thanks.
And then they get real quiet. The next sequence is the man who stepped into yesterday into Avenu Malkenu.
No, wait, I gotta stop you right there.
Yeah.
I'm a Jewish kid from northern New Jersey.
I'm a Jewish kid from Long Island. Nice to meet you.
And so are a lot of my friends who were there with me that night. None of us had any idea they were going to bust out Avenu Malkenu. That was like truly as close to a religious experience as you can have at a music event. Like, this was, how could this be happening? That's all we kept asking ourselves. How is this possible that this band at this night, at this point of the show, where everybody's as hot and sticky and deep into 12:30 on prom night and all that, and then they bust this out? This sort of cemented it for us. This maybe the greatest band ever. No other band would do that. No other band would attempt it, more or less pull it off as beautifully and respectfully as they do.
Agreed. And I think that almost every time they play it. What I love listening, because I'm listening to this show, if it hasn't become obvious already, when I'm listening back to this show, I'm listening to it through two lenses. One is obviously listening to it on its own merits, and the second is listening to it in context of the Phish that we've known before and after. So I love that it's fun to hear Mike's groove to end the first set, and then this suite toward the beginning of the second set, where these suites and these segues are getting settled and finding their places. Like during Avenu Malkenu toward the end, Mike is even using his overdrive pedal, which he still does today. It's the only difference is because the gear is obviously very different. It's almost like Fisher Price, my first overdrive pedal. But it sounds the same. It sounds the same and yet completely different before they go into Lagrange, which is as far different on the spectrum than Avenu Malkenu can be.
But again, that was so exciting for us because the second set, was really starting to pick up some momentum at that point. And then they bust into a track that we were really familiar with. And everybody, that was the right moment for that. That bravo for them for putting Lagrange right there in that set. They knew what they were doing because they had gone through kind of like they had gone real high up and then they had kind of gone into a more mellow piece. And then they just sort of hit the crowd with that and everybody really.
Yeah, they nail it. And I couldn't imagine hearing, for all intents and purposes, a small bar band playing like this, because they not only do they play it, they nail it. They kill it. This is better than any corner bar band who I'm sure all of them has played Lagrange in,
Yep.
You could go see 1,000 cover bands in your lifetime and probably hear Lagrange 800 times.
Yeah, it was fabulous. And it was it's just, if you just look at it, like the whole second set was just one sort of surprise after another. If you're a new fan who didn't know what they were going to do or know about their sort of odd take on things. And then they just kept building it up. And then, Fee and Foam are just incredible.
Yeah, this is kind of I wrote down a stat nerd's wet dream of a set list, right? Fee, Foam, after Lagrange. I mean, Foam especially, it's very deliberate playing in the same way that Reba is very deliberate, where it's kind of slow and practiced. And then to your point that you've said a few times, rightfully so, Page begins the piano section and it's described on the jam charts, quote, as groovy and excellent Page section with solid backing from Mike and Phish. It's all good from there. And yeah, this is Page's version of Foam.
And for us in the audience, and I remember this even coming out of there and listening to this show at some point much long ago, we didn't know Fee and Foam are one song in this set list, right? There's really no deliberation. They don't stop playing one and start playing another. All of a sudden Fee becomes Foam in the jam. And then they're just sort of seeing Foam. And we, again, didn't know that. Going back on it now, I know all these songs and I can make that distinction, but it was just sort of this one long, amazing jam that was very interplay of jazz between the keyboardist and the guitarist. And they were just going back and forth. And it was just awesome.
And as we talk about, you just mentioned a segue from Fee into Foam. There's a classic that comes through next is Okipa into Susie,
Yep.
right? Okipa is classic. It's quick. It's impeccable. But it's really just a springboard into Susie Greenberg, where Trey's voice sounded a little hoarse, but the song is much the same as we know it, right? Great guitar solo, great piano solo and drums. And then bass, it's the same idea that they're each having their moment to shine before they gel together again. It happened earlier in the show during Harry Hood, and then it's happening again of all songs during Susie Greenberg, 3 chords and a chorus.
I also think this is the part of the show where Trey really starts to assert himself. You really start to hear him at the front of everything, screaming on Susie Greenberg, really sort of smashing the chords rather than strumming them. And then, where we go next is, one of the best early versions of that song that I think exists.
Yeah, Josh is talking about Run Like an Antelope, and I don't want to read all of my notes because my notes while listening to this song literally take up half a page. But I wanted to ask you, this is the part that I wrote in capital letters, right? All caps. So they fall into sort of a rock swing at about 5 minutes and 15 seconds, and they kick things up and turn into more controlled chaos, or maybe just chaos. And this is what's in capitals. What does this look like, and what does this feel like in the moment in this small venue? Do you remember?
I remember they kept building it up. It kept getting, I don't know if they were literally physically turning the volume up, which they may have been doing, because in a small club, sometimes bands do that as the set goes on. But it almost was like it was becoming more of a rock show and more of a rock show and more of a rock show. And, can you remember hearing Pink Floyd's The Wall for the very first time in your life, and you hear run, 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 run. And then it was that same feeling when they get to that part of the song when I don't speak Spanish, so whatever he says in Portuguese, and then set the heart for the heart of the sun, and he starts to run, 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 and it was just incredible. I mean, the crowd was electric. That's the part where the people are bouncing and the walls are shaking and they're holding onto the soundboard and hoping that it doesn't fall off the stand. And yeah, it was incredible.
Yeah, this Run Like an Antelope. If I was listening to the show, I mentioned to Josh off mic before we hit record, I listened to this show, I think 3 times this week in anticipation of this recording. And if I could do some weird body switch experiment where I'm back into my 15 or 14-year-old self getting into Phish again, this Run Like an Antelope would be the epitome of what attracted me to Phish. Just nonstop energy. And then they not close it, but then they switch gears yet again to bring out Hold Your Head Up. You brought up Pink Floyd, into Terrapin, where Phish calls it, just ignore the sweet sound you're hearing, and we're going to get into the sweet, sweet love song by Syd Barrett.
Yeah, when I saw the set list, when I went back to listen to this, I remember looking at it thinking, wow, they played Terrapin Station by the Dead? I really don't remember
right.
That. It seems like something, being as big a fan as I am, a big fan, I would remember that. And then I went back and listened, that is not what they are talking about. This is, I don't know what this song is exactly. This is just them having a good time. And they invited some guy up on stage. I don't even think that's Trey singing. I think it's some friend or some dude or
well, Fishman sings Terrapin.
But I know you think that, but go back and listen to it. I think it's some random guy on stage that they brought up, some friend or somebody that they like. I think you even hear him saying, now we're bringing up so-and-so. And so this weird guy gets on the stage and they start yelling and screaming. It seemed to fit in with everything else they were doing that night. I don't know. I mean, we didn't really know what to expect. So this, when you have zero expectation, everything seems normal. And again, they already played Lagrange, and then they go into Hold Your Head Up, which is, Argent. So they're pulling back into the classic rock. So sure, why not? And then they did that for a few minutes, and then they kind of finished to Hold Your Head Up again.
Right. They play the next song and not quite close the set, but getting right there with Harpua. And my first notes with Harpua, this is my cynical self talking from 2025, is this is a weird band. Like, take a look at this second set, knowing the music that we know. It's a miracle that they stuck around, hung on to their audience, and grew it. Because this is a goddamn weird song.
I mentioned this before we started recording, but I would love to meet the guy who was a big enough fan to know this song from the first three notes, because you can hear it clearly on the recording. There's some guy in the audience screaming, Harpua! Like, how on June 9th or June, whatever this was, of 1990, you were a big enough fan to be excited about that track. Bravo, sir. I don't know if you're from Burlington or whatever, but this is early days. And yeah, it's a bit of a weird song. Even to this day, if they're going to play that, that's one of those songs I'm not as excited about. It's a bit of an odd bird, let's say.
Oh, absolutely. One of their oddest, but they close it. You're talking about all the different classic rock covers that they're playing. They close it with a song that's never been out of the rotation, with Good Times, Bad Times. So they opened it with kind of a version of Whole Lotta Love, and they're closing it with Led Zeppelin with Good Times, Bad Times. Like, what a way to end the set after a 14-minute Harpua. Like, this one has never been out of the rotation. They've always killed it. And the part where they sing, I Know What It Means to Be Alone, where Page sings it, it always rocks. It's always fun hearing a very young band try to tackle Led Zeppelin. But they do it. They give it everything they have, as opposed to like an older dad cover band that's more comfortable playing it, in the corner bar, just rocking out. They really give it all they have. And what a way to close the set.
Yeah, my question for, I guess, eternity that we'll never really know is, would they have played this had they not come out to Whole Lotta Love earlier?
Good question.
Had they not said, we played some Zeppelin. Well, we've practiced Good Times, Bad Times. Let's just rock that and let's just go with that. Who knows? But yeah, again, the whole second set for us being new, I know I'm beating a dead horse here, with all these covers was really exciting. Today, I'd be less excited. I probably wouldn't. They can play whatever they want, but back then it was really exciting to have the mix of songs we didn't know that were getting the crowd really excited, and songs we did know.
But we're not done with with covers, because their encore is Take the A Train. Of course, if you're in Manhattan, you got to play this. And before I do the fact check, let's just double check. It's only about a 6-minute walk from Tribeca, from the Wetlands where it was, to the A train, by the way, to the subway station. So it's relevant, it's close by, and it was a regular in their rotation, especially because just a year earlier, they were playing around Burlington as the Johnny B. Fishman Jazz Ensemble to get their jazz chops up to snuff.
I'll say this: there was a very short break between Good Times, Bad Times, and the encore. They stepped off stage for a sec, maybe had a glass of water, and got right back up on stage. There was no keeping it going with the crowd or chants or any of that. So I think part of it was to kind of almost like cool the crowd down a little bit. It was so hot, and so they were like, "What can we play? What two songs can we encore with that everybody's going to like that aren't going to make the place explode. We've already gone there, kind of like we want to finish with a little bit more mellow. And I think both these songs just fit the bill perfect.
And yeah, so the other song that Josh is referring to after Take the A Train is Contact, which is a classic encore, and it's not all that different from any other versions. I have to ask if you remember, did they do the hand waving from side to side during the part they did? Or
I do not remember.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah.
At that point in the evening, we were many libations into a very fun night.
I bet. So, Josh, thank you for coming on to Attendance Bias to tell us about your memories of June 9th, 1990. And at its best, this podcast is a virtual time machine, right? Taking, I would guess, the large majority of listeners, and myself included, to another time in Phish's history that we were not even around or aware, and in a lot of cases, I guess, alive to witness. So thank you for, like I said earlier, filling in those blanks that we could all listen to the music, but what it was like to be there. I appreciate it so much that you took the time to tell us that side of the story, the most important part, in my opinion.
I can't thank you enough for having me on today. I'm really excited to be part of this legacy that you're building. This is the best community in the universe that I've been part of since June of 1990, and I hope to be part of for the rest of my life. And to anyone who took the time to listen to all this, thank you so much for your time, and it's been an honor.
And that's it for today's conversation with Josh Gertz, but we did go all over the place, especially deep into Phish's past, so of course we got to have our attendance bias fact check.
Attendance bias fact check.
This was Phish's 7th show at the Wetlands, and they would return just one more time later in 1990 on September 13th, 1990, a very popular show that featured several debuts of fan favorite songs, and it was widely available on tape soon after it was played. Josh said that as a regular at the Wetlands, he got to know Pete. He is referring to Peter Shapiro, a well-known and very successful concert promoter. Pete Shapiro eventually bought the Wetlands in 1996, and he currently owns Brooklyn Ball and the Capitol Theater. He has dozens of other credits to his name, but this is a short fact check. I can't find any official source, but the estimated capacity for the Wetlands is between 500 and 600 people. The Mo album release party at the Wetlands was on April 10th, 2000. Indeed, the band did open with an acoustic set, and the second set contained a full Timmy Tucker opera. The third set began with a cover of I Wanna Be Sedated by the Ramones. And by the way, I highly recommend L, the band's first live album. The taping of Sessions at West 54th that Josh attended took place on October 20th, 1998. The set lasted just over 1 hour, and it was comprised of 11 songs, 3 of which were broadcast the following January. It was interspersed with band interviews. Just about everyone listening to this fact check is aware of the New Year's hot dog gag. Josh refers to it as the New Year's 1993 at the Boston Garden New Year's Eve. Phish played New Year's Eve 1993 at the Worcester Centrum with an aquarium stage setup. The famous hot dog gag was on New Year's Eve 1994 at Boston Garden. I went back and re-listened to Terrapin a number of times from this show, and I have to swear that it's Fishman singing every time. Maybe the vacuum solo confused Josh about the vocals, I'm not sure. And finally, the guy screaming for Harpua was yelling the name of the song before the band even plays it, so he was requesting it, not just shouting out of joy when the band plays the song. Either way, Josh was right. That's a hardcore fan early on right there. And that's it for today's fact check and today's episode. I'd like to thank Josh Gertz for joining me today, Phish.net for its help with the fact check, Phish.in for the recording used in today's episode, and the Mockingbird Foundation for everything they do to help music education. If you enjoy Attendance Bias, please support the show. You can leave a rating and a review of it on your favorite podcast app, and you can go to www.buymeacoffee.com/attendancebias and donate anything you can. Thank you again so much for listening, and I'll see you next time on Attendance Bias.